everyone for your patience. So I'm going to go through what I went through before. This is a picture of me, just by way of introduction, to get to know me. I was returning from practice a couple of weeks ago in England, and I was on the tarmac in Belfast, and we were all wearing our face masks and social distancing. A little bit about me. So I'm a vet. I've been a vet for 25 years, originally Australian. I'm still in practice. I'm also a qualified forensic scientist. And I bring those two, I try to marry those two sciences, veterinary science and forensic science. And I've tried to do it in this book, Practical Veterinary Forensics, that I've been really lucky enough to edit. And I've contributed to a couple of other books, one in Brazil and the other one in Australia. I'm lucky enough to be a recognised specialist in animal welfare, science, ethics and law, the European and Royal College recognised specialist, and it's a real privilege. So I do a bit of writing, I do a bit of lecturing, but I spend most of my time in court as an expert witness, and I deal with a lot of things from criminal cases, animal welfare, animal cruelty cases, civil cases. I do a lot of material with injuries from contact with animals, and usually people dying, unfortunately. And then one thing I don't advertise too much is I'm a recognised expert in anti-terrorism and agro-terrorism, and that's the use of animals or animal products in the spread or the attempted dissemination of chemical and biological hazards. So believe it or not, I actually get quite a bit of work with regard to that element of the skills that I have. Two words that I'd like you to take away from this lecture, and that's I'm going to be discussing expert evidence. And the two words are, is the expert evidence reliable, and what are the criteria used to assess the reliability of expert evidence? And also, is the expert credible, and how do people assess credibility of the expert? So two things. What makes reliable expert evidence, and what makes a credible expert? The person giving the evidence must be credible, but the evidence must also be reliable. And that's when you're an expert giving expertise and giving expert witness evidence in court. So I realize I'm speaking to probably a room full of pathologists, and I've tried to let out my talk with relevant images from cases that I am involved in currently, but also historically. And the images are there to demonstrate some of the issues that I come across. So in this particular image, you've got ML12 as an evidence descriptor, and you've got obviously two different types of cats. Someone's made a mistake. Is that fatal to the case? Probably not, but it means that whoever's done that has been sloppy, and it creates a bad impression about the reliability of that scientific evidence if you're going to rely on it. And it also creates an issue with regard to the credibility of the person, and they have to say, yeah, we got the cats mixed up, but we use the same evidence descriptor for those two different cats. The court needs to be reassured. It needs to be reassured that the scientific techniques or procedures that you use actually measures what you say you're going to measure. The techniques that you use, the labs that you use, the analytical processes that you use, they have to give the same results when they come from different people. So they can't be operator-driven results. They have to be analytical-driven results, and that's quite important. The lab has to be consistent. And the expert presenting the evidence, again, has to be credible, but they also have to be reliable. So what criteria do the courts use? What criteria can they use? And believe it or not, there are no scientific admissibility criteria in UK courts. So nothing is allowed to, nothing is kept out. You can come to court and you can talk about homeopathy, or you can talk about things that you may believe in, and you're allowed to. But the court will then use the criteria of reliability and credibility to assess whether or not what you're saying is relevant to the case that's being discussed. So there are admissibility standards, but there are no admissibility rules, if that makes sense. So the court cannot reject anything. And we're talking about in the UK jurisdiction, there is nothing that can be rejected from a UK court in terms of scientific evidence. However, there are standards for them to assess that. Okay, and these standards are based on two case law principles that have developed over many years, and they're called the Fry standard and the Dalbert standard. The Fry standard is really the polygraph tests. And I think that it was at this point someone interrupted, and I'm glad they did. And they said that they couldn't see my slides. Can you hear me? And can you see things now? Is that are we winning?
Yes, 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 David, we can see him.
Yes, sir.
Great. I'm really pleased for that. So whoever interrupted, thank you very much for that. And that was really helpful. And I'm glad you did that. The Fry standard, very wordy document, this one, very wordy slide. But Fry standards are those lie detector polygraph type tests. And in some states in America anyway, they're still accepted, but in most places in the world, they're not. But the Fry standard back in 1923, so nearly 100 years ago now, in America, it was if you're using a tool or a scientific tool or a scientific evidence or a scientific process, it has to be accepted or widely accepted within the profession, within the veterinary profession, within the forensic profession. It has to be accepted that what you're doing is acceptable. So for quite a while, if it was accepted or not, really based the idea or the criteria for the admissibility of expert evidence. The problem with that was that if you had something that was a new evolving novel technique that you knew and a few others within your university, your lab, or your profession, only they knew, then that meant that that technique was not widely accepted. So the courts often would have a hard time accepting that as well. So the Fry standard of admissibility, or the acceptability standard, lasted only so long. And it does help to keep pseudoscience out of the courtroom, but it tends to put the experts, the scientific experts who are in court, they're the ones who are in the driving seats. They're the ones who are in the powerful position to determine the outcome of a case. And the problem is that courts don't like that. The courts, and it is right that the courts should be the ones who are in the position to determine the outcome of the case based on the court's wisdom, guidance, and the conclusion the informed conclusion that they will form based on the evidence that they have heard. It's the courts that determine the cases, not the experts. So there was an issue with the Fry standard and the interpretation and application of the Fry standard, the acceptability standard. So what came along after the Fry standard, quite recently, it's 1993, was what's called the Dalbert standard. And again, it's quite wordy, but what the Dalbert standard really means is that if what you're saying, if it's new and it's not accepted, we'll accept it, or the courts will admit it if it's verifiable. So there are really two important words. If you've got an acceptable standard or if your standard is if your test or technique is quite new and it hasn't really been accepted within the veterinary profession or any scientific profession yet, all you have to do is come along and say, look, but I can verify this works, even though no one else knows about it or very few people know about it. It's verifiable. But if you've got something that's acceptable and verifiable, you have what's called very reliable evidence. And they're the two criteria to reliability in evidence. So we haven't crossed the next one yet, which is credibility of the expert giving that evidence. That's another thing. But your evidence, if it's acceptable and if it's verifiable based on Fry and Dalbert, it's very reliable. And courts and others will find it very difficult to argue with reliable evidence. However, you've got to demonstrate that you can verify what you're saying and you're not just making it up, which does happen. So I realize I'm speaking to a room full of pathologists, so I thought I'd show some images that may or may not assist you, just to break up the talk a little bit. However, the point of this photo may not be the point that you think I'm trying to make with regard to this image. And I'm not really looking at the contents of the image, although I know you are. And I need to pull you out of that and take the pathologist out of you and turn the pathologist off, because the important thing about this photo is not the contents of the photo, not what's in the photo, but the positioning of the photo. The positioning of the photo is quite important, and it can be, because this photo, even though the background is a measured background and you have the specimens on top of that background, the purpose of that background is to measure whatever is, or be able to measure whatever is in that, whatever's in that image. And when you take an image that is oblique, not directly in the same plane as the background, and I'll show you this, the camera has to be at 90 degrees to the thing that you're taking a photo of. Otherwise, you may not be able to measure it. So here's another image from, I think it's a horse postmortem at Liverpool University. And again, they've got the measurement marker in. They've got a horse that's got some scratches on its flank somewhere. However, the camera, obviously, the camera is taken by the same person who's holding that marker. It's not in the same plane as the cut as the image. And I'll give you an example. This is some blood spatter analysis. If you look at the ruler, you can use a Mac or you can use a computer, and you can sort of cut and paste. Very simple programs to measure. You can measure that blood spatter, even though, so you don't have to measure every single blood spot at a crime scene. You don't have to measure every single one, but you do have to make the photo and the image at 90 degrees to the plane that you're taking the image of. No oblique images, and that's the point I really wanted to make with those photos. So moving on, funny enough, this is a photo. This is an image that I was actually working on. I'm working on this case right now, actually. So I have on my Mac this picture in a different sort of format. It's a TIFF format. I'm not going to do it because we've had difficulties, and I'm so sorry for that. But this particular case, it's a sheep. It's dead, and there is a claim that you may not be able to see. I don't know if you can see my cursor wiggling around here. Oh yeah, there's a claim here where my arrow is that there's maggots in the sheep. That may or may not be true. The sheep's dead. There may or may not be maggots there. And I was looking at this image, and this is just yesterday actually, and I was thinking that's odd. That's odd. And then I was looking at the rest of this image, and it's not that apparent, but the redness here, the bruising here is quite pronounced in this image. There are other issues with this image that I'm not happy with, and it appears to me that the speckling here that's referred to as maggots, it may well be maggots, but the speckling in other parts of this image, that will suggest to me that the contrast of this image has been changed to enhance this redness and this and this and this area. It's also been changed to enhance this. I had another image, a better image that I was going to come out of the talk and go into, but I'm not going to risk that now. But the point really with regard to that is that there are different elements to this. You have to understand pathology. I mean, I think that's a base level understanding, but there's also elements of this, the forensic tools that you can bring to this with regard to analysis and interpretation of images and other elements that really can give you quite a few tools and arm you with quite a few tools to look at and evaluate evidence from different perspectives. And I was trying to use that as an example. There may or may not be maggots there, but I think this photo or this image, I think it has been, because it's a live case and be very careful what I'm saying, I think this image has been adulterated to enhance certain features that may or may not be there. And that's probably, I'll leave it at that. Again, this is the same image. Again, I had a better one in a different format that can really show you what I was trying to present, but I'm reluctant to pull out of this talk and go to that because of the difficulties that I have been having. So okay, so we have scientific reliability. So that relates to the evidence that you have or the evidence that you want to bring. And there's two elements to scientific reliability. That is what you're saying, what you're doing. Is it acceptable? And is what you're saying, what you're doing. If we don't accept it, can you verify it? Can you prove it? So that's reliability of evidence. And then the second phase to this is credibility. And that really comes down to the expert giving the evidence, providing the evidence, adducing the evidence to the court. And that depends on quite a few things. It depends on status and qualifications of the expert, your experience, your reputation, but also your bearing and the responses to your questions in court. And what I found as an expert evidence is very few people, very few solicitors and barristers who are trained well. They're trained well and experienced well in non-scientific things. They're lawyers. That's what they do. They don't need to understand pathology. They don't need to understand elements of science. I tend to find that they tend to not get science, and they're not very scientifically driven. So they don't tend to attack you or try to approach you or come at you on what you know or what you're strong at. They don't. But they will attack your credibility. That they will try and say, when was the last time you did a postmortem on a rabbit? Or when was the last time you saw an alpaca? Or when was the last time you did this? They tend to try and to undermine your credibility rather than the reliability of your evidence. If they can't touch your evidence that's reliable, they'll try and undermine your credibility. Now, you may have very good, reliable evidence. If they get under your skin and you get annoyed with them in court and start shouting at court, your credibility goes, and with that credibility, the reliability of your evidence is also diminished because the expert giving it has got upset, has got annoyed. So I find a tactic is really to attack the credibility of the expert, not the reliability of the evidence that they're giving. So what tends to happen is, and there's a way to mitigate that. It's probably beyond the scope of this talk. But what happens is if you present evidence in a very reliable way, and they're attacking you, it means that they're really avoiding the evidence that you're bringing. This is another case. This image, just by way of breaking up the talk a little bit. It's a cat, and I'm investigating these cats. And again, this was yesterday. This is a cat, well, there's a series of cats actually that have been within the London area, the M25 area of London, Greater London area, have been mutilated. There's quite a few cats have been mutilated. And for about 5 or 6 years, I've only come onto these cases recently, and I'm reviewing quite a few of them. But for quite some time, these animals, it was claimed that these animals were the victims of predation. This particular cat, it's a close-up, it's not my image, it's someone else's image. It is a good high resolution, good quality image, but it's very focused, and it doesn't really help with regard to the layout and the approach and the environment, which is quite important in a lot of these images. But this cat had its thoracic cavity exposed, and it had its lungs missing and nothing else. And the reports by others was this is predation. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's unusual predation if something is going in there and just taking out the lungs and nothing else. And so there are other cases that can demonstrate, in my view, this is not predation. And there's one case actually yesterday we took an X-ray on Tuesday, and I think I can demonstrate that there is definitely not predation, and there is definitely skillful and purposeful intervention in that cat that would demonstrate to me that there's someone going around killing them. That's just another case that I'm working on. Well, it's an ongoing case, but it's something that I do. It gives you a flavour of the type of work that comes across my in-tray daily that I really enjoy. Okay. What's the benefit of live evidence? When you see someone, when you look at them, when you see how they answer questions, where you're on court, you're on evidence, and you could have the most reliable evidence. It is accepted by everyone and it's verifiable and no one can argue it. But the court likes to gauge your personality, your motivation, and what your working practices are. What is your motivation? What is your why? Not necessarily why are you in court, but what is your why in life? What is your purpose? And the court really likes that. And we all do it. We all look at people, we sum them up and make an assessment of their credibility or their personality or their likability, and often in a very short time, often in too short a time. But when you get examined in court and often cross-examined, you'll find that you'll spend a lot of time. Again, the focus is not necessarily on what you know, it's on who you are and why you're there. It's on your credibility. And I found this only through experience. It surprised me whenever I was in court. No one wanted to talk to me about evidence. No one wanted to talk to me about what I knew. Everyone wanted to talk to me about everything else other than what I knew, because they try to attack your credibility, not your evidence. And that's a function and a feature of the adversarial system. That's how it is. It's another X-ray that I think was the same cat, maybe a different one, that has been chopped by what I think is a bladed weapon. And if it was predation, this is an X-ray, all the soft organs appear to be intact in this animal. And I think if it was predation, they tend to be the first things that go. So I don't think, well, first of all, I don't think a predator in the UK, we don't have predators that are big enough to do that to a cat. And also, if the animal was laying there dead, you'd expect some sort of disruption of the soft bowel contents if we're believing the predation route. So there's an old school approach developed in the UK and sort of filtered down that an expert needs to have knowledge based on really proper training in his or her subject. I do see a lot of cases where you have a lot of vets. Actually, no, yesterday, there was a vet with 5 years experience who did a post-mortem on a lamb, and he had no additional pathology qualifications. He had nothing other than 5 years experience. Now, I'm glad that he's enthusiastic and keen, and what happens is a lot of these experts come to these cases that they're asked to give an expert report. But he's a vet that's playing at pathologist, and I don't mean that to be a very dismissive thing, but when you're on the level of court cases and experts in court, you can't play at being a pathologist. You can't play at being an expert. But a lot of what I find new graduates, recent graduates, 5-year graduates, they get asked by someone to give an expert opinion, and they're almost overawed or shocked, or they can't believe it. It's like a dream come true, and they really want to help. And I think it's really it's misplaced it's misplaced enthusiasm, and that's all it is. But they really come undone because they have no pathology qualifications. The report was quite bad, actually, and I'm trying to be respectful, but he was just probably a little bit young and naive, didn't know what he's doing, and that was reflected quite easily in his report. If you're an expert in court, you got to know what you're about. That's the important thing, what you're about, but also what your evidence is or isn't saying. Two things: your credibility, what you're about, but also the evidence. Is it reliable? You've got to have those two things, because believe it or not, people tend to focus only on the evidence. And if you don't know yourself, and it's a very bad place to come undone, which is in court, under oath, when people start challenging you about what you're about. And that's why a lot of witnesses tend to break down. A lot of witnesses tend to cry and get upset, and they never come back. That's the nature of the game. You need to have knowledge on your subject, but based on proper training. You need to have a bit of humility. And when there is doubt, you need to actually be quite courageous when you're trying to establish a truth, and you need to have a lot of integrity. The most common thing that you will say, or the question that you'll get asked in court, or the answer that you give is, I don't know. That is not within my expertise. I do not know. I'm not sure. Because you tend to get what's called marginal questions, not about what you do know about, but things that are, is it possible is a good one. Is it possible is always probably the most common question you get asked. And that they ask you something about something that's not in the case that you're talking about, just to create that sort of vision or illusion that doubt may exist. And that's their job, and you've got to understand that. But if they're asking something that may be true or may be untrue, you've got to be clear, meaningful, and purposeful when you say it. You just got to say, look, I don't agree with it. You don't snap at them. You've just got to understand that's their role, is to try and undermine you when they can't undermine your evidence. So possibility is probably the common, and I said it's probably the most common thing. So as a forensic scientist, as a scientist, I talk in terms of likelihood. So if you're talking about DNA and DNA evidence, so the famous, infamous, Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky case, and there was a stain on Monica Lewinsky's dress. And I think there's a 1 in 14 billion chance that anyone other than Bill Clinton deposited that stain on that dress. But the question still gets asked, but is it possible someone else could have deposited it? Well, as a forensic scientist, I sort of try and get around this question by saying, look, it is very highly unlikely. And that's about as, for 1 in 14 billion chance, that's about as high as you can go when you're converting a numerical description into a verbal explanation that people don't understand 1 in 14 billion. They don't get it. But when you try and convert 1 in 14 billion chance that this could be anyone else, you use the language of it's very highly unlikely. And you'll keep on getting asked, but is it possible? But is it possible? And they want you to say yes, 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 yes. And that creates doubt. It may or may not be possible. It doesn't matter. I don't use the word possible. I use the word likely. So it's highly unlikely, very highly unlikely. It's equivocal, toss a coin. It's likely, it's highly likely, or it's very highly likely. They're the only terms I tend to use based on the statistical significance of whatever's been put to me. And so I don't use the word possible, because lawyers use that word. They always use that word to create doubt. Don't use possible, use likely. It's likely, it's unlikely. But is it possible? It's likely. But is it possible? It's very highly unlikely. But is it possible? It's very highly unlikely. And you just keep on sticking at that. They want you to say something that suits them, but not you, or not what you want to say, and not your evidence. So there are regulators, and there is code of practice, and we're sort of straying away now from pathology and veterinary science. We're going to forensic science, and there's a really important, I guess, construction in addition to the tools and the armory of things that I have and that I possess that I can use, that the knowledge of forensic science training I found really, and trying to marry that to veterinary science, and trying to marry that to being an expert witness in court. However, there is a code of conduct for forensic science regulators. It's not within veterinary science. It's not likely to come in anytime soon. And as long as those codes and standards aren't regulated, aren't maintained, and aren't put in place, there's going to be a lot of disparities between quality of expert evidence and quality of expert credibility. So in the UK, the forensic science regulators, if you're an expert witness and you're giving evidence in court, the staff that you have that provide expert evidence in your organisation must have sufficient knowledge, and they must have sufficient level of training. They must be able to explain their methodology and reasoning in writing, in orally, but in a way, you've got to explain scientific concepts. I spent a lot of time talking about body condition score, emaciation, and weight loss, prolonged negative energy balance. You know, I've got to explain biochemistry and the metabolism of glucose and fat ketone bodies, and then protein and catabolism. I've got to explain that to an audience that doesn't understand that, and I've got to do it in a way that's not patronizing, but it's also, it flows, but also there's a skill to convert very complex scientific, biochemical, physiological concepts into language that people understand without talking to them like they're six. And that's a skill. That's a skill to learn and refine. There's been a few cases in the UK where there's been issues with expert evidence and expert evidence credibility, mainly credibility. And what has happened is that there's been a lot of this in the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years, and it's an evolving thing that constantly gets refined. But without going into the case law in the UK and without going into the cases, but I put it here for reference because someone might want to look up our Carrion Reefer case. It was a maritime insurance claim. Someone said that the owners had sort of conspired to sort of run this ship aground deliberately, and it was a big case. And Mr. Justice Creswell, he comes up quite a bit with sort of advising and promoting this idea of sort of expert evidence and expert witness reliability and expert witness credibility. And he set out 7 rules really for an expert. And I've got them here. It's quite wordy, and I'm sorry about that. So your expert evidence should be independent, okay? And you need to, your obligations to the court and your evidence needs to be objective, it needs to be unbiased in relation to matters that are within your expertise. Don't advocate for those who instruct you. Don't decide that they're guilty or not guilty and then form your opinion on that. It's your obligations to the court, not to them. You should state the facts or the assumptions on which your opinion is based. And don't leave things out just because they don't suit your view. But just state your facts, state your assumptions. This is part of that verifiability thing. And you'll find that when you have something that you are stating, if you can verify it with references, documentation, pictures, or other forms of verification, you'll find people are very quiet about it. And that's, of course, way of accepting it. You will often get invited in court as an expert to give an opinion about something that may not be within your area of expertise, because it's almost a test and a trap by others to try and get you to bite. And what that means is to try and get you to stray outside your area of expertise and to give an opinion on something that you know nothing about, because again, it's almost an attack on your credibility. You know, how keen is this guy to give his opinion on everything? I'm not sure that was a question. Maybe someone had their microphone on, but I'll continue. We can have questions later, I'm sure. If your opinion is not properly researched because there's insufficient data, then you've got to say, look, this is my provisional opinion, and because you're saying that your report at the time that you sign it, on that date of your signature, is the truth, and it's the whole truth. And what I'm finding is, as a tactic in a lot of these cases, is you won't be disclosed with all the evidence until you write your report. You write your report, there's a duty on others, an ongoing duty of what's called disclosure. They then disclose more evidence. And then you get asked in court, well, why didn't you say that in your report, Dr. Bailey? And you say, well, I didn't have that evidence at the time I wrote my report. So if you change your mind, you've got to say it. That does happen. And when you refer to photographs, documents, calculations, plans, you've got to, well, you can put it down, you can cut this down to, you've got to retain them, you've got to record them, and you've got to reveal them. So whatever you're using in court, you've got to show the other side as well, and they've got to have that advantage to decide or determine whether they agree with you. or not, or disagree with you. So there's been further sort of refinement of the Creswell tenets. You've got to show your academic professional qualifications, the substance of your instructions. Did you receive oral or written instructions? So I'm not instructed as a vet in these cases, and that's quite an important distinction because I'm instructed as a forensic and veterinary specialist in these cases. So it covers my forensic science qualifications, which I use quite a bit in these cases. My veterinary science experience, of course, I use that. And then also my specialist qualifications as a European recognised expert. And the reason why I say that I'm instructed in that, and I insist that I'm instructed as those three things, is because it gives me a wider remit to comment on things, to comment on evidence, non-animal evidence that I can comment on, particularly because of my forensic science expertise, non-animal evidence that I can comment on, particularly because of my ethics and welfare, my specialism. I can comment on these types of almost the necessity is the suffering necessary, is the welfare, except I can comment on these things because I'm a specialist, so I'm not just defined as a veterinary expert. So I have to set that out in my report, that you're almost getting 3 bites here in the one expert, and I have to explain that because a lot of courts are just used to hearing and seeing from someone who's just a vet. And although I am just a vet, I have other qualifications that allow me to widen the scope of my opinion. So I need to show my methodology or the information that I'm basing it on. And again, that comes back down to that, is what I'm saying verifiable? And then here's something that can snag quite a few people. When there's a range of opinion on something, you've got to, well, the courts like you to provide a range of opinion. The Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons in the UK doesn't. When you're certifying something, that you can't give something that's ambiguous or that has more than one definition or meaning. And it's a bit of a quandary because I'm a vet in the UK, I'm governed by the Royal College, but when I'm an expert witness in court, my obligation is to the court. The court wants as many opinions and many definitions of something as possible. The one that I use quite a bit, the most frequent one that I use in court is the definition of the word emaciation. It's the most used word in court that I see used by others. Emaciation does have a definition, but I think it's a poorly understood definition amongst vets. So the rule of thumb here is when there's more than one definition of something, none of them really work. So I tend to just use one definition, even though the courts want me to use more than one. If there's a range of definitions, if there's a range of opinion, we're talking about veterinary science, pathology, and biology, there's going to always be, there's always more than one definition for anything in the biological sciences. The physical sciences tend to, they have laws of physics and laws of motion, and it's quite good, it's quite easy to understand and predict things. But biology doesn't have that. I tend to use one for clarity, one definition for things for clarity, and then I'll say, look, other definitions are there, but this is one that I'm using. You've got to use relevant literature and relevant documentation. You have an expert report or expert compliant report stating the duties of an expert. And then if you need to do additional report after disclosure of additional evidence, you can do a supplementary report. So retain, record, reveal really are the things with regard to evidence. You've got to take photos of things, you've got to record the date, the time, everything about it in your observation. But you also have an obligation, believe it or not, to reveal that to the other side if they ask if that case is going to be a legal case. So I've got a case here, so I don't know if you can see my thing. This was over 10 years ago. This is probably one of the first cases that I did in London. The dog here, I don't know if you can see my cursor on the left, was bitten. It was then put in this RSPCA plastic bag, and on the right, believe it or not, this is the same dog. The dog sweated, and the evidence changed in my view. So if you look at this wound here, it's almost absent here. But this dog is dead. This dog is dead. It's the same dog, but you have a lot of evidence that's changed because you've been put in a plastic bag. Use a body bag. They're designed to avoid this. When you have a sealed plastic bag, body bag's a bit more breathable. When you have a sealed plastic bag in hot weather, you do get post-mortem changes. And I couldn't believe that this is the same dog when I saw these two photos. I just couldn't believe it. And I couldn't believe that this was the dog. The dog had been bitten by another dog. I can see the bite marks, what appear to be bite marks there. But I couldn't understand why We had a wound here in the same dog this dog is dead. Both images there are dead. We put it in a plastic bag and then the wound heals, or appears to heal. I couldn't believe it. There was something strange about this case, but I never got to the bottom of it. Actually, I forget what the result was in that case. It was a long time ago. But it sort of piqued my interest, this case, about evidence and about changes that can happen in evidence. So look, there are regulators, codes of conduct that you can avail of. It's a conceptual thing rather than a specific thing that needs to be sort of gone through in a very wordy PowerPoint. So I won't go through it, but if you come from an organization, an academic institution, a laboratory, a company, and you are giving expert evidence, you need to have some sort of regulation, you need to have some sort of standard if you're a medium-sized company, because again, it's your expertise, your evidence won't be challenged, but your credibility given that expert evidence will be challenged. So these are ways to sort of put in place to guard against that process. There are regulators' codes of conduct, and you'll find these not in the veterinary literature, not in the pathology literature, but in the forensic science regulation literature. And it may be something you may want to look at. The lab that you want to use is what's called an ISO 17025 accredited lab. There's only one lab, veterinary lab. When I say veterinary lab, they do clinical pathology, so hematology, biochemistry, that sort of thing. It's a 17025 lab. It's registered in the UK. I think it's IDEX. It's a very hard qualification to get. It's a very hard standard to get. But when you have a lab that has that qualification and that accreditation, you tend to have confidence in the management practice of that laboratory. You do. However, that doesn't mean that you can't challenge anything that comes from that lab. You can, and I do it all the time. Not that lab, but 17025s. However, as a standard to try and mitigate against criticism of your processes, your training and procedures, because the evidence won't be argued against, but your credibility as an individual, but also as a corporation, will be argued against unless you have some sort of ISO or management system in place to ensure continuity of evidence, to ensure the evidence has been recorded and retained and it's been stored. It's quite an important concept to have, and again, it's not in veterinary literature, it's not in pathology literature, but it's in forensic science literature. The quality management systems, if you don't have one in place, it's something I think to consider. And 17025, it's what's called a reference standard, and there's only one lab that I know, one veterinary lab, IDEX, that has this. And a lot of labs that don't have it, I tend to find that if I search around for through their reports, if I search around for what they're saying, I tend to find holes in what they're saying. So, okay, we're coming to the end of the talk now. Sorry to rush a little bit. So this is my view. I've been doing this for a while. I enjoy what I do. But you miss more in a case by not looking, rather than not knowing. We're really lucky. I grew up in a time, and I graduated in a time pre-internet, believe it or not, and we didn't have the information that we have available now. You can find out whatever you want very quickly these days if you know what to look for. But when you're doing forensic science cases and pathology cases, you will miss more by not looking rather than not knowing. If you don't know stuff, that's fine. You can go out and find out about it, and you can learn about it fairly quickly. But not looking, so it's a real skill to learn that sort of thoroughness of looking for things and looking through things. That's my first tip to you. You miss more by not looking than by not knowing. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, this actually is a photo of a young child. It's a representation of a young child that was bitten by a dog. It was savaged by a dog, and you can see the patterns and distribution of wounds on that particular small child, and you can relate that to the behaviour of the person who had the dog on the chain, who was using it to abuse and actually ultimately kill this child. Was a case I was involved in. Most expert disagreement is on interpretation. When you're in court, you can say, well, that's a dog, and someone else says, well, actually, that's a very big dog. Well, no, I don't think it's a very big dog. I think it's just a big dog. You'll argue about interpretation and often silly things and marginal things. What I find is, and it's going back to this being accredited and having a management system in place, is I tend to, as an expert, I look at not necessarily the interpretation of something, I look at the analysis and how things were done, how things were performed. And I find that you can, as an expert, you can be quite useful and quite helpful when you use the approach of not necessarily what you are saying or what you're interpreting. I'm going to look at and focus on how you got there and what you did. So I tend to focus on the analysis, and then the interpretation. I mean, we're vets. We're going to have different interpretations about things. That's a given. So I sort of bypass the interpretation part, and I tend to focus on not what you're saying, but what is the reason for you saying that? What is your analysis, and how do you do it? And you'll find often when you ask people how they got their information, they tend to go quite quiet because they don't expect that question, and they don't want it, and they don't want to answer it. They don't want to answer it. And I don't know why, but that's the bit that I go for every time. I don't care what you say, but I do care what you're basing it on it. And again, it comes back down to this verifiability, and that's a really important concept to put into this talk. And barristers, and it goes back to probably one of the very first slides. I think we fear one thing: a truthful expert. They don't understand science in a scientific way, or they have a limited understanding or lower understanding, and you'd expect that. But they'll attack your credibility or the organization that you're in. They'll attack that, whether it has a management system or doesn't have a management system in place. They'll attack that. But if you're truthful and your evidence is good, they get scared. Now, they'll never let you know that they're scared, but that's what they fear. They fear only one thing, and that's a truthful expert. They really don't like that. This is a case that came in this week. This is a cat. Very quickly, this is an ongoing thing. It's a live case. One of these M25 cats. The photo below shows the cat in the garden with some intestines next to it, and the photo above shows the cat without its tail. So this cat has been mutilated. And then I took this X-ray yesterday. The cat in this photo, this is the X-ray of it. It has its abdominal contents, but in the photo below, the abdominal contents or part of them have been placed next to the cat. So this is what I believe to be what's called a staged crime scene. So people thought for many years that this cat was predated on by others, but I think that someone has killed this cat, put it there, and put the intestines of something else, probably another cat, next to it. And everyone thought that the intestines belonged to this cat. One of the biggest problems is that there was actually no way the intestines could have come out of this cat to be placed next to it. So I took an X-ray yesterday, actually, and the abdominal contents are still in that cat. So this is now probably an ongoing criminal investigation of this cat killer in London. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry that there was a little bit of distraction at the start, but I finished, and I thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. So are there any questions?
This is very nice.
Dr. Bailey, just a few minutes. Yeah.
Of course.
Can you ask Dr. Selvaraj to?
I'm.
Hello,
I can hear you.
David sir, can you close your PowerPoint, sir? Sharing.
Well.
You have to stop sharing the PPT.
Okay, I understand. All right, just 1 minute.
Thank you, sir. We had a wonderful lecture from Dr. David Bailey. Shall we move on to the next speaker?
I wish to thank Dr. David Bailey He has thrown a light on the art of photography, how to take photographs when we are taking gross lesion, and that is being used as an evidence in the court. And he has also enlightened how the witness has to be. We have to be independent, and whenever a question comes out of our expertise, and we should make it clear that is not in our purview. He has also told about 3 R's: retain, record, and review. So that is we have to retain the evidence, and we have to record it, and we have to reveal it in the court of law, and we have to be very honest when we are giving our witness, expert witness. So, and most of the time, for the pathologist, we miss by not looking than by not knowing. So that is exactly true. So that means we have to get practice. We should do as much work as possible. Then only we will get our expertise.